Well, howdy, y'all, and welcome to the Big Rock Candy Mountain, the place where me, your host, Caleb the Carter Taylor, is going to be talking about something special this week. That is one of my favorite childhood movies, Sleeping Beauty. And I hope everyone is having a wonderful day on this Wednesday as we celebrate our Lord's Ascension tomorrow on Ascension Thursday, even though it typically gets moved to Sunday, whatever it's tomorrow. Today's show is going to be a little different than last week. Rather than looking at some piece of Christian doctrine like we did last week, the Mass, we're going to go back in time and talk, and we're going to go back in time to 1959 and talk about Disney's Sleeping Beauty. And I've also got a special guest with me today who will be giving a little short defense of fantasy and talking about its merit specifically. And before you make any sort of rash accusations, yes, I am a male. And no, it is not weird that I liked and after rewatching still like this movie. We'll get into reasons very, very soon. But first, I would like to give a short plot of the story. And no, the Disney version is not the horrific 17th, 16th century version that involves very many bad sexual things. This is totally P. I guess it's probably G. This is totally G. It's Disney. And a more modern version, if you would prefer more of the folky style, the Grimm brothers version is only like a 10-minute short read, and it's very, very similar to this, while still maintaining some of the older elements that are a good thing, I think. So I'm going to put a link of that in the show notes. Yes, while being a grandfather, I still know how to use technology. So check that out if you like, and now let's go over a little brief sketch of the plot of the Disney version. So basically, king, queen have a child. Well, first of all, once upon a time, a king and queen have a child. And they're going to the christening for the child, and they don't invite Maleficent, like the big bad evil figure, the big villain. And she gets upset. She's like, why didn't you do that? So then she curses the child, like, haha, you're going to die at 16, sucker. Well, luckily, there at the christening, there's 3 good fairies. 2 of them have already given the gifts of beauty and song, of course, because it's Disney. And the third one says, oh, I'll just make her fall asleep. So they do that, and the 3 good fairies decide to take her into hiding. And while she's in hiding, shortly before her 16th birthday, Aurora meets her true love, Prince Philip, though she doesn't yet know it. But of course, since she is a damsel in distress, she cannot be kept too safe and still finds a way to fall asleep, which launches a gruesome battle between the 3 good fairies, Flora, Fawn, and Merryweather, Philip, and they are fighting against Maleficent, of course. And since it's a fairy tale, they beat her and live happily ever after. Initially, some of the reasons that I really like this movie is because it is incredibly impressive and gorgeous, the artistry itself. The color palette, the medieval architecture, it's so harmonious. It's like a Mahler symphony on screen. And, well, speaking of composers, another reason is the adaptation of the score for the Sleeping Beauty ballet of Tchaikovsky is incredible. That it's really smart that why would you reinvent the wheel when one of the greatest composers of all time has already done the work for you? And specifically, I think, other than the march and all of his little unique elements, I like the little oboe bassoon duet for Maleficent's theme. It's really simple and sweet, but it just like reeks and eeks of medieval villain. It's very eerie. My compliments to Alicia. And lastly, this story follows the archetypal structure to the T. And I love that because the formula works. That's why it's a formula. So just follow the formula. I mean, that's what Disney's been doing for the past 20 years. Just think of the Marvel movies. It's pure formula. But one little scene I wanted to talk about, really silly. But you can see the detail that they put into this. And that's why it stuck with me, because the facial features and the little movements are so well done. I was kind of shocked, and I was like, that was good. So it's the Once Upon a Dream sequence in the woods when Aurora is dancing around singing, and the animals have taken Prince Philip's clothes, and they're acting like the prince, and then suddenly Philip joins her in singing, and it takes her a second to realize because she's so darn naive. And she starts going on like, oh, this is a man, and he is cute, and he just wants to continue the dancing. And then she starts to play, hard to get, of course. And she starts running around a tree. But she's like, my goodness, look at Philip. How could I say no? And then Philip's like, bingo, gotcha. But of course, you got to give him a chance. But Disney puts all the reactions really well together, and it just looks like it was real. It doesn't look like somebody drew this. And then Philip asks, well, when will I see you again? And she's like, oh, never, sorry. But no, wait, I'm just kidding. You can come by the cottage later. Young love. All right. Enough of that nonsense. Let's bring on our special guest for today. And I'll tell you what, all the way from Oxford, we have the renowned writer, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. How are you doing today, Professor Tolkien?
Well, I'd be doing much better if I had a nice ale in my hand. What is this you Americans talk about, Southern hospitality? I haven't seen any of it here.
Well, I'm sorry, Professor. It's still morning. It's before noon here on the East Coast, so it didn't seem appropriate to already start day drinking. I guess I'm just not much of a host. Sorry about that. I'm still getting used to this thing, so you'll have to forgive me, I hope. But, yeah, so I can go get you something if you want. It'll just take a minute of my time.
Take a minute of my time, you say? Ask your questions, my boy. Come on now. I'm going to be canonized before you utter something useful.
Professor Tolkien, I don't think you can be canonized while you're still alive. That doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, good thing I'm actually dead, you ignorant boy. Now stop wasting my time and get on with it.
You're right. Sorry. Of course you're dead. I'm just talking to you in my imagination. Well, I'm glad you decided to join me. And my first question I'd like to ask you, very general, but I'd like to draw from your famous lecture that people can find in an essay titled On Fairy Stories. So the question is, why should people not be afraid to like fantasy, and why do we have fantasy in the first place?
Well, to begin with, fairy stories are not generally stories about fairies, but about farare stories, covering all of that land or country which holds many things beside fairies of any size. Besides elves or fays or dwarves, witches or dragons, it holds the sun and moon, the sky, the earth, and us as ourselves. The stories about fairies are far and few in between. Fairy stories are about men and women and children in the presence of the marvelous. It is hard to define fairy stories in a positive sense, but let's do so negatively. I would immediately disqualify travelers' tales, beast fables, and the sort of dream world that is Alice in Wonderland.
Well, thank you. I like that little part you had in there, that definition, men, women, and children in the presence of the marvelous. That's quite a statement. Another question I would have is, what exactly is the purpose of these fairy stories? Like, what makes them unique, and why should we have them?
Well, I would answer that by beginning with the statement, they are not necessarily written for children. But he who would enter into the kingdom of fairy should have the heart of a little child. They may have a children's heart, but they also have heads. The splendid joy of entering an author's subcreation. And now, these fairy stories have three elements. The mystical, it moves the reader towards God and the transcendent. The magical, towards the capacities of the world and what can be experienced in this life. And lastly, what I would call the critical. Fairy stories are full of joy and laughter. Just think of all those lovely songs and poems I've placed in The Hobbit. Always with lively spirits, those hobbits are. Now, to the use of fairy stories, I would only make a short comment. Renewal and escape. With regard to the latter, to judge whether escape is good or bad, weak or strong, we must know what we are escaping. Do not confuse escape of, say, a prisoner with that of a deserter. One who deserts the world is running away. An evil boy. But one who is imprisoned within this crumbling world can find great joy in a simple story of heroes and villains, good triumphing over evil, instead of the world's self-made misery. I should let you know, my boy, that though this life may have many blunders, and may make you look like a fool, it will all be worth it one day. Just have patience.
Well, that was quite enlightening. Thank you, sir. I didn't expect that little rant at the end. I would commend all of our listeners here at the Big Rock Candy Mountain to read your excellent essay on fairy stories. I know when I read it, I found it quite beautiful, even if I did have to break it into parts because it's rather long. One final question before you go. I know you're quite a busy man. Who is your favorite character from The Lord of the Rings?
Well, that's like asking me to rank my children, boy.
I'm quite fond of Galadriel, I must say. If you read my letters, though, you'll see that I'm certainly identified with Faramir, though he possesses a courage I certainly do not. And, of course, the good Samwise Gamgee. Being the hero, as I have said, is I love him so well. He's so small, insignificant, unlikely, and quite content to be treated as all those hobbits are. Well, I quite like old Samwise Gamgee myself. If I had to choose, I think I'd pick Faramir. He's pretty cool. He's a pretty cool dude. But, of course, I like him in the books more than the movies. Peter Jackson did not portray him well. It makes him look like a little weak boy eating too much soy. But that's another discussion. Well, thank you for coming on, Professor Tolkien. I'm glad you were able to take some of our time. And I hope to have you on again sometime soon.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you, my boy. And I bid you farewell and a good day.
Thank you. You as well. What a legend. What an absolute legend. All right, let's take a deeper look at the story itself of Sleeping Beauty and then ask, well, who is the protagonist? Because no matter what that title says, it definitely ain't Aurora. All she knows how to do is pick berries and fall asleep. So our next character, or candidate, is Prince Philip. He's the one who does the killing, the rescuing, and he gets a little bit more screen time with his good old horse friend. He does all the heroic deeds, which would make it seem like he's the hero. Except for the fact that I'm claiming he doesn't actually do any of those things, at least without a lot of help, from the three good fairies. Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. Now, that's right. Keep your seats. These three old ladies who can't even cook in the 14th century are the protagonists, and I would also claim the first feminists. But before the details, just think about it. The fairies make all the important decisions. They have agency. They're the ones who drive the plot. Philip is just an instrument. He's just an instrument. He may follow a certain hero's journey, or he definitely follows the hero's journey, but he's not the one who does everything. But the three good fairies prevent Aurora's death. They hide her. They rescue Philip from Maleficent, and they give him a magical sword and shield that, without otherwise, Philip is burnt toast. So basically, my point is that the central conflict is not a little romance between two bumbling fools, but a fight between Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather and Maleficent herself. Okay. And I think that if you were to watch the movie again, you pay attention to this thought itself, you'll see these elements very clearly. That the ones who are different at the beginning and the end are the fairies, whereas Philip really doesn't undergo any sort of characterization. So let's get to the good part of today's episode. Let's get into the Christian elements of the story. Unfortunately, I think that the Brothers Grimm version does preserve more of these elements, but looking at the Disney version, there's still a lot that we can work with and talk about. So I'm going to try to make a lot of connections, some better than others. And so here's the first one. Initially, when Aurora is born, she will die because of the curse of Maleficent. But the third gift that she gets from Merryweather only puts her to sleep, i.e., this can be seen as a type of baptism that cleanses original sin. Secondly, the king tries to destroy all the spindles, but Aurora will nonetheless still taste death at the hands of Maleficent, which I see as showing the futility of a Pelagian works-based righteousness rather than justification by grace. And the next one is a little bit more obvious in the traditional story of Sleeping Beauty. So, after the princess falls asleep, the whole kingdom sleeps as well, and a hedge of thorns covers the palace. This is still in the Disney version, but it happens in like a matter of minutes. So rather than this being a short scene, it happens over a period of 100 years, and many men attempt to rescue the sleeping princess, but they cannot get through this hedge of thorns. They get stuck in it and are pricked to death. But then finally, after the 100 years, there's a worthy and chosen prince who goes forth into the hedge, And doing so, the thorns turn into flowers and separate like the parting of the Red Sea as the prince walks through. The prince finds Sleeping Beauty and awakens her with a kiss, which is a obvious picture of the resurrection when Christians are the resurrection of the body, when Christians will indeed be called out of sleep by their prince. When Sleeping Beauty awakens, her entire kingdom awakens as well. Her attendees, the horses, the dogs, even the flowers on the wall. And in this, we see how Christ, who is the Prince of Peace, calls for his bride, the church. He kisses her and redeems her. In all versions, the story ends with a wedding, in the same way that Christ is united with his bride, the church, at the marriage feast of the Lamb. And these are just some pictures of how the story follows examples of the New Testament. Unfortunately, one thing that I wish, but it doesn't go into, is that the Disney version doesn't go into any details of the barrenness of the queen's womb before she's able to conceive Aurora. And if this element had been kept intact, we could think of women who were thought to be barren and then, by an act of God, have a child. We could immediately think of Abraham and Sarah, Rachel giving birth to Joseph in Genesis, Hannah giving birth to Samuel, and Elizabeth giving birth to John the Baptist. So, yeah, I mean, I wish that detail had been kept intact, but it probably was not child appropriate, I guess, to be talking about the womb. So if we look at the characters, though, Maleficent is literally the devil. I mean, her name means mistress of all evil. And at one point, she calls upon all the powers of hell when fighting Prince Philip. I mean, it's explicit. It's not like they're hiding anything. And in her fight with Prince Philip, or as I'm claiming, she's really fighting with the fairies, but in their fight, the fairies give Philip a sword of truth and a shield of virtue. And this sword itself has a cross-like hilt, and the shield has a silver cross on it. And we think about sword of truth and shield of virtue, we immediately go to the 6th chapter of Ephesians. And it's extremely explicit. Let me just read verses 10 through 17 of Ephesians 6. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and have done all to stand. Stand therefore, having girded your loins with truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the equipment of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, with which you can quench all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So we see here very explicitly mentions of these instruments of the armor of God, which we see clearly in Sleeping Beauty with this sword of truth and this shield of virtue. And furthermore, in the older versions, which I would encourage you to read if you can find the time and are able to find them online, they are certainly online, is that this part is also played up as well. And my final point is that this movie deserves more credit than it gets. Less hate for being, some example of a damsel in distress that needs a pretty boy. Because these fantasy stories, whether they have hard magic like Harry Potter, or it's like a subtle soft magic like you see in The Lord of the Rings, they're worth more than face value. As Professor Tolkien himself said earlier, they can take us to a deeper experience of God, the world, and provide genuine laughter and joy. So I would say do not be afraid of something that seems childish, because that is only what people who don't appreciate it probably think of it. At some point, I would like to be able to do just a hate fest rant on Frozen. But if not, I would talk about positively the 2015 live action version of Cinderella, because it is so Christian that it literally punches demons in the face. To talk about the old Disney movies, some reasons I don't like them. The old Cinderella movie is literally about the mouses. And I could not care about the mouses. I know it has great songs in it, but it's about the mouses, and I couldn't care at all. The old Snow White movie, I just don't like to look at her, because she's like, I just, no. And the prince is in it for like 2 seconds. Anyways, but that's really all I had for today's episode. Next week, I was thinking about doing this book on Paul I'm reading in his first century Jewish context, which is super interesting, looking at the biblical scholarship of the past 100 years, and the ongoing debates between, it's not just Catholics, but Protestants, Jews, Orthodox, and secular scholars about how does Paul interpret himself as a Jew. Super interesting. And there's been new things that have been put forth in the past year, I guess, that are really adding to the conversation. It's always funny when you read things about something like Paul, because the authors themselves have noted that people like Aquinas have literally made the same points in his commentaries on Paul. It's just that they're being reintroduced now because many people in the biblical world have a sort of stigma against the scholastics, unfortunately, because many people do not like them that are not part of the Catholic tradition. Or, other than talking about St. Paul, I was thinking about doing an episode on St. Ignatius of Antioch, who I see, if you read his letters, as literally just like the next generation Paul. I mean, his Greek writing feels like St. Paul, and it reads, and it furthermore gives you an image of the church a generation after. So if some things are not entirely clear about like the structure, or if some people find it hard to find Catholic doctrine, which is why Protestants might, like they say, well, it's not in the Bible. You can see that it's there, and it's further developed in that next century in the writings of Ignatius. I haven't quite decided yet, though, but those are the two thoughts. So, from all of us here on the Big Rock Candy Mountain, which is just myself, I bid you farewell and a glorious Wednesday.